Hey folks, Dave here, and as a PC gamer and someone who basically plays PC games almost exclusively, except for when I bum a console off of Joel to play something, I occasionally have to go through the PC upgrading process. And I've been on the lookout now for a while for an upgrade for my graphics cards. Not because I want more power, but because I kind of want less power, at least less electricity. My current rig has an i7-930 overclocked to 4.0 GHz on a H50 Corsair water cooler, as well as 6 gigs of Mushkin DDR3 RAM, and this is the kicker, 2 GTX 480s in SLI. If you guys don't remember the GTX 480, it was the first generation Fermi card from Nvidia. It was almost a year late, I think it was, and it barely came out at all. This card was a monster, it was incredibly powerful, but it was way too hot, used up way too much electricity, and it even had these gigantic heat pipes hanging out of the side. And yes, I had 2 of them in my system. Just to give you an example, the average load temperature of just one of these GTX 480s is about 92 degrees Celsius. Combined, they put out an insane amount of heat and noise. The 40mm fans on each one of these GTX 480s sounds like a jet engine taking off. I actually moved the desk in my office to get my computer further away from my microphone for recording, because even doing noise cancellation in my audio recordings, it was just really messing up my audio. In the wintertime, these 2 cards would actually heat my office almost entirely by themselves. All of that heat comes from the very high wattage of these cards. Just a single GTX 480 can use up to 350 watts of electricity. All that being said, these are really powerful cards. My frame rates were amazing in everything. Nvidia has really stepped up their SLI game, and my efficiency on my second card usually ran between 70 and 80%. In Battlefield 3, these 2 cards were able to maintain between 70 and 90 frames per second, or a solid 60 with VSync turned on. It was thanks to these 2 cards that I was able to record the entirety of my Battlefield 3 Silence in the Storm slow motion series. These cards were able to maintain those frame rates even while recording. This original computer is from 2010, however. The platform is aging and I'm still stuck on USB 2. Obviously I do a ton of video editing, and a lot of my footage is stored on external hard drives. I have 2 USB 3 drives for recording, totaling 3 terabytes, but I have to use them over USB 2.0 and eSATA because my motherboard does not support USB 3. This year, I've been on the lookout for an upgrade to be able to get rid of my SLI, move to a single card solution, and add a PCI Express USB 3.0 expansion card so that I can actually use USB 3 for my recording drives and other accessories. This motherboard has a number of PCI Express slots, including a 1X slot. However, the 1X slot is taken up by my sound card, and then I have 2 slots occupied by the GTX 480s, and the last slot is covered up by the second 480. Last week, I ran across a decent deal on a used GTX 680. This is last gen, but it is a beast of a card. The first thing that caught my eye was the amount of cores. A single GTX 680 has 1536 cores. A single 480 has only 480 cores. That's more than triple the amount of cores in the GTX 680. The next thing I looked at was the core clock. Now the 480 is clocked at 700 MHz per card, for a total, assuming peak efficiency, of about 1400 MHz. The 680, however, is only clocked at about 1006 MHz. Its boost clock is able to go up to 1058 MHz. Still, even if we assume that the efficiency of the GTX 480 SLI is never 100%, that leaves the core clock of the 680 a bit behind. I wasn't completely sold on the upgrade, but I decided that I could go ahead and flip the GTX 680 if it wasn't worth it, and if it didn't work out, so I went ahead and purchased it. After upgrading from the 2 GTX 480s to the GTX 680, I definitely have more appreciation for Nvidia's improvements to SLI. SLI is much more efficient than it used to be, and I would say that I actually underestimated it. Don't get me wrong, the GTX 680 is a monster of a card. It's also more power efficient and much less noisy. The sudden drop in noise is probably what I noticed first. This card is almost silent compared to even just a single GTX 480. It also draws much less electricity and therefore runs much cooler. My load temperatures haven't topped 82 degrees Celsius, and even that is overclocked. Performance wise though, I kind of paid for a minor downgrade. At its stock 1000 MHz clock speed, the GTX 680 cannot match the GTX 480 SLI. That 1400 MHz of the two cards combined just outclasses it, even with the extra cores on the 680. I noticed this especially in Battlefield 3, where my frame rates dropped around, I'd say 15 to 20% at times. Also in Battlefield 3, when my frame rates would drop, they would drop to much lower than with the 480s. Some of those drops would actually go into the low 40s briefly, whereas with the two GTX 480s, the worst drops I ever got, even in the most intense action on the biggest maps, would usually only drop into the low 50s. So that's how the GTX 680 almost became the upgrade that wasn't. After the first couple days of installing it and seeing the roughly 15% performance drop and comparing the benchmarking scores, you guys have seen some of them flashing on the screen right here, I was about ready to go ahead and sell it and go back to the 480s. But before jumping the gun and trying to sell the card, I wanted to try to overclock it. By just using the EVGA Precision X software, I was able to overclock the core clock from 1004 MHz to 1215 MHz. That's roughly an 18% increase in clock speed. And after the overclock, the GTX 680 came very close to matching my two 480s. In addition, I had already installed my USB 3 card, and that was amazing. Going from an average write speed on a USB 3 external drive over USB 2, where it was around, I'd say 20 megabytes per second peak, to 125 megabytes per second was unreal. That is a massive increase in speed. I love USB 3. I waited a long time for USB 3. In addition, like I already mentioned, the lack of noise and heat were instantly noticeable. Over the next 6 months, I might save enough on my electric bill to actually cover the cost of this upgrade after selling my two 480s. So after the overclock, I'm pretty impressed with the GTX 680, and at this point I'm leaning very heavily towards keeping it. But after seeing some of the gameplay footage and hearing about the difference between the two cards, I want to hear what you guys think. Should I go back to the 480s or keep the newer GTX 680? I'm looking at selling the 480s now because they are dropping in value. Each month that goes by takes away from what I might be able to sell them for. That also might open up for, in the future, an upgrade to GTX 680 SLI, which would be amazing. With winter coming up, however, and the lack of my heat from my 480s, I could possibly freeze to death. It's a very real possibility. Well, those are my thoughts on the GTX 680 versus the GTX 480 SLI and the upgrade that almost wasn't. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.